Insomniac Spider-Man is back, bigger, and more brutal than ever. We've spent the past 2 weeks swinging through New York City, including Brooklyn and Queens, in Marvel's Spider-Man 2. A follow-up to both 2018's Spider-Man and 2020's Miles Morales, Spider-Man 2 thrusts players in the shoes of both Spider-Men in a story that balances the intimacy of being your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and villains that are hell-bent on achieving their goals even if it comes at the cost of leveling New York City. But how does Spider-Man 2 stack up against the amazing feats of its predecessors? Does the inclusion of not only Kraven, but Venom as well, deliver the epic stories that we're accustomed to with the inclusion of these major Spider-Man threats? Listen on to our review of Marvel's Spider-Man 2.
I know I can snap him out of this!
We can fight this together!
Hey everyone, welcome back to the 20M podcast. My name is Arif, one of the co-hosts here at the 20M podcast, alongside the other amazing co-host, Reno. Reno, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you? It's been a while.
It's been a while, and what a episode to be back, because this is a very special episode. Our Spider-Man 2 review. I'm just super excited. But before we get to the review, how are you, Reno?
I'm doing all right. I'm excited to hear about your thoughts because I know you've sort of finished it. I have not played it, so I'm gonna be coming in, asking the questions, getting to know. I mean, I know Spider-Man from like a movie-goer person perspective. I don't know Spider-Man from a video game perspective, so I think I've got a lot of questions for you.
Yeah, and I guess why don't we jump right in, because again, maybe before we jump into the full review, this is the official review for Marvel's Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5. A couple ground rules and a couple things before we jump into this review discussion. The first thing is that PlayStation provided the code for our review copy, so thank you PlayStation, and full disclosure, it was a review code that was given to us. The second thing is I have played the game, and maybe in terms of where we are here, and I have finished the story and I've gotten the platinum trophy, so I've done technically everything in the game with about just under 30 hours under the belt. And in terms of spoilers and what we're going to get into, I think this is such a hard one to navigate, but I'm going to be as spoiler free as possible throughout this entire thing. And if there are things that I consider spoilers, which I think I'm pretty I don't know. I just want to approach this in a way where it's there's so much in this game, Reno, and there's so much to spoil without it being a major spoiler moment. But I'm going to try and keep it as spoiler free as possible. But I'll try to mention it before we get into any specific section that there might be some spoilers in a certain direction here and there. But other than that, we're just going to have a nice, interesting discussion on, I guess, our thoughts on Marvel's Spider-Man 2. But Reno, you said you're not a Spider-Man person. Maybe what's our Spider-Man histories in a nutshell?
My very recent history is so I was traveling overseas, as you know, and I was on this ridiculously long plane. It just went on for 500 hours, and so I managed to catch up on movies. And I saw the latest Spider-Man. Is it Into the Spider-Verse or
Beyond the Spider-Verse?
Beyond the Spider-Verse?
Yeah,
it's the second one, right? So that's my Beyond the Spider-Verse. Okay, so that is my most recent history with Spider-Man, the IP, and that was fun. It was a great movie. I can totally see why it's an ARF movie. But that's kind of it. I've watched most of the main ones as well, but in terms of games, I think I haven't seriously played a Spider-Man game since the PlayStation 1 era. It's wild, right? But what about you? You're a fan? You're a fan of the games?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the games. But I'm also just in terms of my Spider-Man history, it's who isn't a Spider-Man fan, right? And it's I also grew up reading a lot of Spider-Man comics. I think my uncle passed down a lot of amazing Spider-Man issues from the 90s. So I flipping love Spider-Man as a property, and I totally grew up as Spider-Man.
Just when you said my uncle passed, I wasn't sure if you were gonna go. My uncle passed away, and therefore.
Oh my god, Ben part earlier. That's terrible. We're gonna what a terrible Spider-Man reference. So I'm a huge Spider-Man fan. I grew up with the comics, and I think as it pertains to this review is I loved the first Insomniac's first Marvel Spider-Man game, and it was awesome. It was a awesome refresh take on the property. But I guess in a nutshell, I love the Spider-Man property, and I'm really excited to talk about this one, mostly because the TLDR and like my overall impression of this is that Marvel Spider-Man 2 is an amazing game, let alone an amazing Spider-Man game. And what I think it does best is that no matter if you're a fan of the movies, if you're a fan of the comics, or if you're a fan of like even Spider-Man pop culture, it weaves everything into this game in a way that is so new and fresh and familiar, yet makes something so incredibly original and true to themselves. So despite, whether you're coming as a new fan of Spider-Man, whether you're just a fan of video games and whatnot, this is like an incredible, incredible game. But Reno, where do you think we should start with our review discussion on Spider-Man 2?
I just have a really quick question, and then it's kind of embarrassing one because it'll probably show my age. But like the reason why I didn't play any recent Spider-Mans is because I come from that era where like a game is just made for the sake of it when the movie comes out.
Yeah.
Like way back then, right? But what I understand with these more recent games, like the Marvel Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2, these are like original stories that are not part of like any movie that recently came out. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think maybe just like the history of like Spider-Man games as well, it's like 100% they were very much in tied with like the movie franchises. So whether it be like the Raimi Spider-Man games and then also like the Amazing Spider-Man games, but like Spider-Man games have also had a history where there are actually a plethora of like original Spider-Man games, but maybe they just don't hit that mainstream element. I think like Web of Shadows, if I'm not mistaken, is probably the most notable recent one. I think probably PS3-ish era. I remember for me it was Ultimate Spider-Man on the PS2, if I'm not mistaken. So like all those are like versions of this, but in a nutshell, I think Insomniac brought it to a whole new level where you have one of the best video game developers in the world, obviously like known for Ratchet and Clank and some amazing properties. But then they took something that is around the time when the Tom Holland movies were coming out, yet made a super original, super high budget, super blockbustery Spider-Man game that just felt like, yeah, it's not a tie-in. It is its own thing. Whenever you see the suit, it is so recognizable. But they're paving Spider-Man into a direction where it's like, this is one of the most temple like Spider-Man properties at this point, or like Spider-Man iterations at this point.
Yeah. All right, yeah, that sounds really cool. So like, if we were to compare like this current Marvel Spider-Man 2 and the one when was the Spider-Man 1? When was the Spider-Man 1 game? Like
it was a couple. It was 4. I need to look this up. Spider-Man 1, Insomniac. Spider-Man 1 was, I'm gonna say 2017.
That sounds about right. Because I think as well, like I did briefly play that one on PC when I think the PC port came out, but that was like a couple years later. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like if you've played both, like how do you compare them?
Yeah. So super interesting because I guess that's $1 million question, right? How does Spider-Man 2 compare to Spider-Man 1? I think again, when you talk about like the history of Insomniac Spider-Man, they had the first Spider-Man game come out in 2018, and then a couple years later they had a smaller full game, but a smaller experience with Miles Morales that came out, which was, I think, for the PS5 and optimized for the PS5. And then now this is their like big coming out party for the PlayStation 5 and all new tech and what they've learned from the past 2 games, right? How does it compare? Reno, it's so funny when we talk about sequels in the Sony franchise. You talk about like God of War Ragnarok, you talk about Last of Us Part 2, you talk about like Horizon Forbidden West, like all these sequels to these like IPs that are becoming mainstay new generation PlayStation IPs. They're almost always way better than the first game, and Spider-Man 2 is no difference. Like I think Spider-Man 2 elevates so much from Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales. But I think the major difference here is like, and I've been trying to articulate this I was thinking of ways to articulate this, right? Is like Spider-Man 1 is awesome, and it is a million different side quests, amazing story. But for me, what made Spider-Man 1 truly, truly amazing was the ending sequence. I think the back half of that game is so powerful and it's so tight and it's so emotional and so meaningful. When I think of Spider-Man 1, I think about that like last couple hours. Spider-Man 2 is a whole different beast where I don't think it has that major emotional like hyper. Obviously, it does like climax towards the end and it does like have a trajectory in that way. But to me, Spider-Man 2 is consistently awesome. Where no matter if you're playing like a side quest, no matter if you're in like the first early missions, the middle missions, or the late missions, all of it feels like it's ramping up to something. When I feel like the first Spider-Man game had a little bit of like pacing issues, some parts had dips here and there, some side quests were more interesting than others. So I would just say that Spider-Man 2 is just way more consistent than Spider-Man 1, which I think just makes it overall a just incredible experience over the first Spider-Man, which is so hard to believe. I think the one thing I'll just mention really quickly is combat too. Like in terms of like what's changed in Spider-Man 2 versus Spider-Man 1, number one is like combat is elevated. So the major difference is that you get to play as both Peter and Miles. So you can swap between the characters, which is really cool at any point in time in the story or any point in time when you're pretty much like traversing the world, which is a major difference because you have the first Spider-Man game, which is Peter, then the second Spider-Man game, which is Miles, but now you can swap between the two. Their combat and their animations obviously are an evolution of their respective games, but are just, again, just tighter. Like this team is learning ways to elevate like the things that they've had before. And to me, I had so much more fun playing it. But the major thing, Rena, I know we can get into story and we can get into some other stuff, is that when you think of Spider-Man, you think about swinging through the world, right? And it's awesome when you have these two characters that are moving slightly differently, they're animated slightly differently when they're swinging, but at the end of the day, Spider-Man is about swinging, right? In this new game, they introduce a whole new section of New York. So now you have like Brooklyn and Queens as a playable area. And they've been on record, and there's so many interviews about this, and I'm pretty sure this is like old news to a lot of people, but there's not a lot of high-rise buildings in those areas. So how does Spider-Man get around? They introduce web wings. And so you're zooming like through the city of New York, through Queens, through Brooklyn, with like little like web wing shooters under, you know what I mean? Like little like Superman things. And it is such an awesome new addition that makes it kind of like, it's obviously like in Spider-Man lore, but you don't see it too often. But to me, it just like makes this game so much more fun than the first one, to zip around New York through your web wings versus like swinging, or a combination of the two. I think it just adds another dimension to the gameplay. So that's my long spiel about like gameplay differences and whatnot. But yes, it is Spider-Man 2, I guess in a nutshell, is an elevation of this first Spider-Man game and Miles Morales, and it's an awesome experience.
I'm pretty sure my last Spider-Man game experience, like he would just shoot the web like into the sky, and you just not question it, because it's like PlayStation 1 era. It's like no one questions where it's attached to. It's attached to Mars. It's attached to a plane that's flying across, and just like goes all the way up there.
Exactly.
Yeah, that sounds really awesome. Like having the web wings mechanic as well. But like, okay, like let's talk about story, because that's like, you know, usually my favorite part of video games. Like, what is the background of Marvel Spider-Man 2? Because I've only seen I know Venom's in the game only because of the meme. You know, the whole like 19 inches of Venom.
100%, yeah.
So I know he's there, and I've seen the trailer where the two Spider-Man characters like that you mentioned, Peter Parker and Miles, fight Venom. But like, what's actually happening? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, so this is great. So maybe to touch on, like you said, the story of it all is that this takes place after Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales. I think it's about a year after, about a year after. So Peter is slightly older, Miles is slightly older, than in slightly different places. But at the end of the day, Miles has already had his origin. Peter has been swinging around as Spider-Man for a while, and they're basically trying to navigate this mentor-mentee relationship. So the game starts off with a little bit of like how is Miles adjusting to his new life as Spider-Man, and how does Peter fit into this role of like being a mentor to him, yet also both of them solving crimes and being Spider-Man together in New York, right? And I think just a really cute thing that I want to mention, and again, you can see this in trailers, you can see this other stuff, they're both Spider-Man. So like in Miles Morales, I think Peter is away on vacation, Miles is like Spider-Man in New York City. But I love that when they're interacting, it's like, hey, Spider-Man, like catch this or whatever. And then the other Spider-Man, you know, Peter is like, hey, Spider-Man, you know, good job, Spider-Man. So they're both Spider-Man. It is awesome. But in terms of the story, I guess the major thing here is that this game introduces Kraven the Hunter, which is a Spider-Man, you know, one of the rogues, part of the rogues gallery of Spider-Man. And this whole shtick, and you'll find this out throughout the game, is that he moves from whatever jungle area that he is, where he's like top dog hunter, and needs to find his next prey, or needs to find his new challenging grounds. And obviously the place to go is New York City, because that's where all the supervillains are, it's where all the, you know, superheroes are. And Kraven has moved to New York City and is causing chaos throughout New York City, trying to hunt down, I guess, major supervillains in the Spider-Man mythos. So that's like story A. Obviously, the major, like you said, marketing materials indicate that Venom is in this game. So this is also a story of Venom, its origin, and the Spider-Man Venom story that you kind of like are expecting, but in a way that is so Insomniac. I don't want to spoil too much of how it is, and I don't know who has played the first game, or maybe I'll just put a quick thing. It's like spoilers for the first Spider-Man game and spoilers for Miles Morales. Let's put that right at the forefront. Venom is already teased in the previous Spider-Man games, and Brian Itzahara, the creative director of this game, has been on record saying that like when they want to tell the Venom story, do they want to tell the Venom story, and they want to make it great, and they want to make it authentic, and they want to make it whole, right? So this is the time where Venom gets introduced, and there's no Eddie Brock in this game. Venom is essentially Harry Osborn, and you can
is
see
that canon?
That's why it's this game. Like they made it in this game. So at the end of like the Spider-Man games, like you see the Venom symbiote on Harry Osborn, but you don't actually see anything beyond that. It's just a tease, right? So this is officially where Harry Osborn's Venom comes into the world, and it gives a whole history with that. I guess I'm just sharing this in a nutshell to say that like Venom is in this game. I don't really want to get into the details of what that means in the story and where it goes, because in my opinion, it is mind-blowing. But Spider-Man 2, in a nutshell, is Kraven comes to New York. Spider-Man's dealing with typical Spider-Man stuff, balancing, for Peter Parker, it's about balancing Peter Parker's life with MJ. For Miles, it's about balancing school and being Spider-Man and growing up. But then you have these existential threats like Kraven and Venom in the story. So it's just one of those classic yet very, very interesting Spider-Mans.
That's very cool. But I guess what happens with these games as well is there's a lot of like lore building, and there's like side characters and there's side quests. Like how does that stack up against like the main quest line? Is it interesting, or is it kind of just like something to do on the side?
Yeah, which is an awesome thing, because I was going to say that like the best thing about Spider-Man 2 compared to Spider-Man 1 is that the side quests are, I think, a little bit more tightly integrated into the story, where there are side quests. But to me, I think like video game developers are reaching a stage where, again, it's the Witcher 3 kind of like influence on everything, right? Where side quests are pretty much just as good as main quests. I think the side quests have been, again, just are on another level compared to the first Spider-Man, where some of them are samey. So like you go around the world, you do a bunch of different quests, and they lead to a certain part of the story. Whether you're Miles or whether you're Peter, you have different side quests related to those characters. And essentially, you're swinging around New York. You see a little icon pop up on the map, and you go to it, and it's a side quest. And each icon is like a different version of side quest. So one of them that I'll tease, which is I think in the material, in some of the marketing material now, is like Mysterio. So Mysterio is in the world, and as Miles, you can go to these like little dungeons, if you will, these like experiences that are just Mysterio related, and they're kind of like your typical like beat certain enemies by a certain amount of time, like I don't know, there's like criteria of what you need to accomplish. But then once you go through that quest, like the Mysterio side quest to me is so flipping interesting, and it's things like that are replicated throughout its side quests. So the moment to moment is like side quests have really incredible stories, but there are respective ones for Peter and for Miles, and all of it is kind of like taken from the first Spider-Man game, the Miles Morales game, and then new things that they introduce here. I want to tease the fact that there are instances where, just like the first game, that Miles and Peter may not be the only playable characters. As to what playable characters are in this game, I know technically we can talk about it. I just don't want to talk about it. I want people to go into Spider-Man 2 completely fresh and just be mind blown about like what moments they're taking over. But I want to bring this into a larger conversation about side quests and side stories, where the beauty of Spider-Man 2 is not just its story with Peter and not just its story with Miles, but they really like take time and effort to flesh out MJ's story, or flesh out Haley's story, which is kind of like the love interest on Miles' side, or bring in like really meaningful moments with Miles' mom and his uncle, the Prowler and all that kind of stuff, where no matter if it's like a main quest or a side quest, I think the best way to play Spider-Man is to play everything, because all of it is in service to each other, and all of like, even though Spider-Man is on the name of the like game and it's like how it's marketed, it's really a story about the Spider-Man like universe. It's a really like a story about the Spider-Man family as opposed to just Miles and Peter, and I think they really hit it home with Spider-Man 2.
I think this brings up like a really interesting topic that we can cover in a separate episode, which is like kind of like the value of side quests, because a lot of people you hear a lot about like, I guess what Final Fantasy 16 is like, oh my god, the side quests are so boring, or like some people find other games where it's really interesting. And I guess like the way like I visualize it is like, you're going through this like path in the woods, and it's like there's a detour here, and like how can you make people want to take that detour and also feel like, oh, I spent this extra time that doesn't impact the storyline, but it was worth it. So usually it's like there's a reward at the end, like if you don't do this, you don't get ability, or story is so good that it's like, oh my god, I learned so much about the character by taking that detour. It's like, how can they make it meaningful? And it sounds like Spider-Man 2 like really hit that nail on the head with like really fleshing out the side characters is what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, and it's like side characters, but it's also like what they do in the side quest. So I think like a major complaint that I had with like the first Spider-Man game is that like the type of side quest that you do is so samey. And I'm not to say that it's not samey in this one, but like you go to this thing, like I think one of the ones was like you go to an area, you try to find like the loose pigeon, and then you grab the pigeon, like swing through the city, you grab the pigeon, and then deliver it to like the guy who is like housing pigeons, like Howard, I think, right? And like that just happens so often, and there are some small variations here and there, but every single time I got tired. Like you do one side quest in Spider-Man 2, and you're like, I can see exactly where this format is going. You go through it, and I'm like, okay, great. They'll always switch something up in every single side quest, which is like I think the difference between like Spider-Man 1, I think they switch things up towards like the latter end of those side quests where like, oh, it gets different towards the end. This one, every side quest I feel like has similar qualities yet is different. So from a gameplay standpoint, it's like the side quests are always fun because you never know what to expect, even though they follow the same format. But I think I'll go to a deeper aspect of this is like to talk about the magic of Spider-Man 2 is some of the side quests also epitomize how much the team cares about Spider-Man. So you see it in the first one, you see it in Miles Morales, where it's like Spider-Man helps out New Yorkers, right? Like that is the whole thing. It's about, maybe you'll stop an existential threat, you'll work with the Avengers, and you'll like go like in the history of Spider-Man, right? But at the end of the day, it's like your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And I got flipping emotional in Spider-Man 2 because there's a couple side quests, and maybe for those that are playing it or those that have played it, maybe you can look forward to this one. But like there's one where you're playing as Miles and you're helping one of the Brooklyn Visions Academy students with a homecoming dilemma, if you will. And for me, it's just like you're helping a student out on campus. You're Spider-Man, you're like whipping through things, but it's not about defeating a villain. It's about serving the people of New York. And to me, that is Spider-Man in a nutshell. And the fact that Insomniac is able to articulate those like intimate, beautiful, touching moments in a side quest, yet to make it like, I don't know, just like to deliver on the voice act and deliver on the gameplay, deliver in like that moment is again the magic of Insomniac to me. It's like they care about story as much as they care about like set piece and gameplay, and they're firing on all cylinders, if you will. Again, they're one of the best developers in the world, so you're not really surprised here. But I just want to articulate that like Spider-Man 2, despite its huge ambitions, is so intimate at the same time, and it makes me very, very happy from like a Spider-Man fan's perspective.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you've captured it exactly. Like Spider-Man is like the everyman superhero, right? Like it's almost comical sometimes, but it is very real. And that he juggles day-to-day life as much as he juggles like large, impending, like world apocalyptic sort of problems. Like he's doing that, and then he's like saving a cat from a tree, and it's like funny, but it's also like very much what you'd be doing if you are the friendly neighborhood superhero, right? But let's leave that for a little while. I do want to talk a bit about the hardware side of things because I know that you really love your DualSense, you love your tech, and we've covered it in previous other game reviews. Like, how does it work with Spider-Man 2 this time?
Yeah, and like again, this is why I love talking about this for Sony exclusive stuff, because the DualSense is like probably the easiest way to do it. Like maybe I'll talk about tech first before we get to DualSense. So like one major difference is the SSD, the power of the SSD for the PlayStation 5, right? And like new gen consoles where like loading is just a lot faster. I kid you not, and I've seen other like people talk about this before, so I was expecting it already, but the loading is incredible in a way where you have a massive, like basically like modeled version of New York, right? Whenever you switch between, or whenever you want to fast travel or you switch between Miles and Peter, it's instant. There's no loading screen. There's no like major, like, you see the like background. I think in the first Spider-Man game, you see like shots of Peter in the background and then like it'll load to like whatever, right? If you're in like downtown Manhattan, for example, and you're Peter and you want to fast travel to Brooklyn, you just like open the map and you click the area and you click the fast travel button and the camera like swoops into the like map and then you see like Peter swing by. So like the fast travel is so like, again, it's like a video game thing where it's like there is fast travel, if you will, right? And it's so seamless, but the PlayStation just like is able to process it so quickly that like it's small things like this in tech that I kind of like enhance the video game experience where you don't have to think about loading anymore. And it's like loading is kind of like a thing of the past, if you will, So that's like one thing. But then on the sense of the DualSense, yes, the DualSense is like properly used, just like most first party games at this point, where it didn't realize to me at first because there's so much going on in the controller, but you can feel the footsteps of the character. And that is like the level of detail that I was not expecting, where when you're walking slowly, you can feel the literal like left, right. I'm like playing through the game. I'm like, what is that?
Spidey sense.
Yeah, right.
It's essentially Spidey
senses. You're nailing it. Yeah. So you can feel it, but it's just like two things that I want to talk about the DualSense of like how Spider-Man 2 really interestingly uses the DualSense is whenever like, I think if I'm not mistaken, whenever a podcast episode pops up, the J. Jonah Jameson podcast, or I think the Danica podcast and Miles Morales, whenever they come up, the little sound comes from the controller. So like the podcast intro comes from the controller, and like, oh, like, okay, it's like it adds to that like experience. But then on that note as well, when you're looking for collectible boxes, you hear a little beeping sound. And at first I didn't know what it was. I thought like my DualSense was busted. But with the closer you get to the box in the world, the louder the beeping sound is on your controller. So again, it's just like it adds to this like immersive experience. And then the one relatively spoilery kind of thing with the DualSense that I think is mind-blowing and so flipping scary is that, and I want to talk about this later, but when you get to the Venom section, obviously you know that Peter is captured, like at some point gets like the symbiote on him. And Venom is like, you have the Venom iconic like lines and the Venom iconic just like grunts and just like noises or whatever. That comes from the DualSense. So like when you're playing as like, you know, Spider-Man Venom or whatever, or when you're doing combos or when you're like entering parts of the story, you kind of hear it through the like the game audio, but it really comes through on the DualSense as well. So it adds this level of like, what the hell was that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you know, like, you know how like formidable and, you know, scary, if you will, Venom is, like that again just added to that experience for me. So the fact that they're able to weave in the DualSense in the way to like tell this story, but again in a way that it like
in a way that makes sense.
It's in service.
Right?
It's in service to the story. You know, it's in service to the feel in the world. It's just awesome.
Because because you're Spider-Man with the symbiote on you, so it makes sense that the sound of Venom would come closer to you and feel more sort of like primal, like right next to you.
Exactly.
That sounds amazing.
Yes.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's, well, there you go. Another Arif Love DualSense a little bit for everyone. What else can we talk about? Like, I mean, compared to like, I guess other games, I think you mentioned Ratchet and Clank a bit earlier as well. Like, is there something you want to talk about in relation to those two games? And then like, you know, are there, and also just after that, because I know you kind of like dive into it. What are the negatives? Like, I'm sure there are one or two things that you like to just like comment on. So let's kind of like wrap those together.
Yeah, exactly. So really great one. I just wanted to mention that like Insomniac has been making games for forever, right? And you know, I love Insomniac, and I think they're one of the most mind-blowing studios next to Naughty Dog in the PlayStation world, but mostly because of my affinity for Ratchet and Clank. I was so surprised, and again, part of this I don't want to spoil, but like, there are things that Insomniac takes from their previous games and puts it in Spider-Man. And that makes sense from a development perspective. That makes sense from a video game perspective. Like, if you're using the same type of technology, same types of thing that you've learned from one game, you can put it to the next. But to say that there are things that, there's a major thing in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart that is basically utilized in an amazing set piece in Spider-Man, it's there. Like, I so don't want to spoil it, because when I was doing it, I was like, oh my God, they're just using the tech and the main thing, you know, from Rift Apart and like putting it here, but in a way that's authentic and really interesting. And it's just so fascinating to me. But then it goes back to like this thing where when you love a developer, you kind of notice all the things that they do and like how they integrate things in. Where one of the things I think I'll spoil this one because I think it's a lot less like stakes, if you will. But in the first game, you can use your spider bot. And I think you can use a similar bot in Ratchet and Clank as well. And they kind of like operate within each other. But this one, it feels like a direct like tie where the spider bot in Spider-Man 2 is almost exactly like the little robot from Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. And it's just so cool because like that's an interesting way to do side like moments. So why not recycle that like experience if it already works in one property or the other? But to me, it just goes back to like Insomniac being super efficient, where if they found something that works in one of their games, even though the properties are very, very different, utilize it in a way that is authentic and meaningful, but also adds to the gameplay is awesome. Because it makes sense that Spider-Man would use little spider bots in like, you know, a gameplay section. So all I'm going to say is that there is a moment where it's so Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart and it's awesome and it's in Spider-Man, and I don't want to spoil it because it's flipping cool, but it shows that like Insomniac is really like taking what they learn from every game that they do. So I can't wait to see what their future projects are. Like, what is Wolverine going to take from Spider-Man? What is Wolverine going to take from Ratchet and Clank? Like, it's not a sentence that I was going to like, I think would be, you know, especially from Ratchet and Clank, not a sentence that I would conceive, but it's going to be a thing. And then like, as I'll say the last thing in terms of like, as we try to tie up this like discussion is the negatives. Despite how high I am on the game, and I'll give maybe some like overall thoughts at the end here as well. But I'll just like caveat this one where I say like I did have a review build and I was playing it quite early. I did have the game crash on me a couple times. My assumption, the benefit of the doubt, is that like there's already been patches and like there was already a patch after I finished the game in platinum already, so I'm assuming it's fixed it. There's not a lot of technical hiccups, but I did have a couple bugs in the review build and it did crash like 4 times, which is not what I'm used to for like this type of polished experience. But again, take that with a grain of salt, right? But it was slightly buggy and did crash a couple times. Not too worried. I think they're going to clean it up, and otherwise, like it's ran so smooth that it's like ridiculous. There are the other negatives that I've been like struggling with Spider-Man 2 is I'll start with the softer one, where, as you know, when Venom takes over Peter in any Spider-Man story, he becomes edgy and mean and kind of like, you know, just
bad boy Peter.
Yeah, Peter's classic Spider-Man 3 Peter, right? But some of the lines just don't work for me. Where there's that super, it's on the marketing collateral, and it's like, I think something along the lines of Miles saying it's like he has big teeth or something like that, and Peter's like, so do I, or something like that. It's just so lame, and it's so like I get that you're Venom, yeah, like I get that you're Venom, but it doesn't work. So for me, like I know Yuri, the voice actor, you can tell when he's doing his like when the symbiote is taking over his mental psyche and he's like being a little bit more angry, and there are moments where that delivers where you're like, holy shit, dude, like calm the fuck down, kind of a scenario where it's like you feel kind of tense in that moment. But then there are other lines where it just doesn't land for me. So the whole Peter Venom didn't fully like, I wasn't totally sold on that like experience of that performance. And then the other thing that I'll say is that like it's such a pro and a con, which is such a cop out, but we talk about like video game and the trajectory of video games in general and AAA video games, right? But like Spider-Man 2 is awesome because there are like so many major set pieces that are mind-boggling and like awesome when you're playing it. But I get to a point where like I'm getting to a point where I'm kind of afraid that AAA games are so heavily reliant on set pieces, and they're so overwhelming, they're so amazing, they're so awesome that they kind of all like mesh together and are somewhat forgettable. So it's kind of interesting because like what I remember a lot from games are like intimate, slower moments and like really impactful like story moments, right? Which maybe could be a preference thing. But in a game like this, which it's hard to knock it because from a technical perspective, from a gameplay perspective, from an experience perspective, these set pieces are awesome. They're awesome to play. They're tactile. You feel great fighting these bosses and whatnot. But to me, when I look back at my experience, sometimes I'm like, I can't remember the moment-to-moment fight of X boss or Y boss. I remember some moments from it, I guess, or that like I was in there. But when you're in it, you're being like super overwhelmed by everything. So I don't know if this is not a knock on Spider-Man. It's more of a knock on like AAA development and AAA games now as well. When you can pull off giant, enormous, like magnificent set pieces, but when you have so much of it in one game, it kind of like it doesn't saturate it per se, but it's just like you get this weird feeling where sometimes they're kind of like overwhelming or potentially forgettable.
That feels kind of like, I don't know if it's exactly the same comparison, but just like the MCU movies in general. Like I think when they first started coming out, they were like amazing, you know, so much action, explosiveness, and really cool. And then now it's like I can't tell like Iron Man 1, 2, 3 apart. I can't tell Thor 1, 2, 3 apart. They all just kind of blur into one big mush in my head. Mm-hmm. So yeah, maybe it is just sort of a case of like too much action or too much, like not to say like too much greatness, I suppose, but it's just like too much of this same. It's like a I don't know, like a extravagant buffet, right? You eat too much of it, you just kind of get like, oh, like I don't even remember what the steak tastes like. I don't know, but I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But yeah, like so overall, great experience. Overall, it sounds like you had an amazing time.
Yeah, and I'll maybe like wrap up my Spider-Man 2 review by saying like I'm trying to be. It's so weird because I want to review this. I want to be true to like, you know, the people that are listening, that those that are interested in playing Spider-Man or on the edge or whatever, right? Which is why I think like people look out, search up like review type discussions. In all, I would say that Spider-Man 2 like super surpasses like I say supersedes like the importance of Spider-Man. Like it surpasses everything that Spider-Man 1 does, and I think it's an awesome, and I think I would argue other than Last of Us Part 2, it like is my favorite sequel to like a game. Again, Ragnarok, we'll get to the Ragnarok discussion at a certain time or whatever, and I did love those games, but for me like Spider-Man at the end of the day is so fun. Like other than the story, other than the set pieces, other than the technical marvel, like pun intended there, I guess. Spider-Man is like one of the most fun games that you could possibly play on any video game console right now. The fact of swinging around, like solving, like doing little crime things here and there, upgrading your weapons, and I forgot to mention like the amount of suits that are in this game is also mind-blowing, and that's all spoilery for me because I don't want to spoil any suits, but like let me tell you, some of my favorite Spider-Man suits are in this, and some like really interesting, mind-blowing suits are also in this, but like they're all cosmetic stuff, right? But I'm sure you'll find out as you play the story. All of this is in Spider-Man. All of this makes Spider-Man so fun. So like outside of what they accomplish, again, on story, on animation, on gameplay, you can't stop playing Spider-Man. Like there's a reason why like I platinumed this game alongside finishing the game, and there's a reason why I talk to so many friends that are in the games industry or not in the games industry, but they always talk about like, oh yeah, like I don't usually platinum games, but I platinum Spider-Man, right? There's a reason for that, and so I think Insomniac deserves its flowers on following up a phenomenal experience in both Spider-Man Miles Morales with Spider-Man 2. I'll also like kind of end it by saying that the Venom story, which is what everybody's kind of like waiting for, and I'm really trying not to spoil the experience because I want people to go in like experience that story for itself. It goes in directions that I was not expecting, and there were two like oh shit moments for me where it just like as a Spider-Man fan is just like I flipping love that they put this in the game, you know? And I've been trying to articulate this. I'm thinking about ways to articulate this to my friends as well, where whatever you think is in a Spider-Man game and whatever you think makes a good Spider-Man game, 90% it's going to be in this game. Like it's more likely than not that they like Insomniac has thought about it and they thought of a smart way to put it in this game, and it is in this game. You know what that means, I think, is like up to interpretation. I really don't want to spoil it, but as somebody who'd be like, I think it'd be like really interesting if they did this, right? And then in some way they would do it, and not in the way that you expect, if you will, but in a way that is authentic and true to them. And there's so many surprises where, like I said, this is not one of those things where there's a major surprise or there's a major like spoilery moment. The entire experience to me is a spoilery moment because it just goes up and up and up and up and up, and it introduces things left, right, and center, but all in a way that is so tightly woven. Like I said, my overall experience is that there were some hiccups here and there. There's some things that didn't land, but it is undeniable that Spider-Man 2 is a like just such a fun game at the end of the day, and is so worthy of like look, if you're a fan of the first Spider-Man game, like play this one, and if you have a PlayStation 5 and you just want to have fun, just play this one. And even if you're not a Spider-Man fan, just play Spider-Man. Like I don't know how to articulate it other than that. Like I'm very high on this game, but I also want to acknowledge that I don't know, maybe we can get into much more nuanced discussions about like the direction of Spider-Man, the direction of Insomniac, and all that kind of stuff in a more spoilery thing. But at current time, like I just had a blast.
Awesome. It's been a blast like listening to you talk about it. Like I haven't seen, I mean, we haven't recorded in a while, but I haven't seen you this excited in a while as well too. So no, that's amazing. I think basically it sounds like fans of Spider-Man will love this. Non-fans of Spider-Man will also love this. So
yeah. And like again, I want to have a spoiler discussion at some point in time. I would love to like see what everybody's thoughts are at the end of the day. Like there are, again, the stuff that for me, maybe not so much negative, but more interesting, I think really comes through in spoiler discussion. But I'm so excited of where they're taking this property. And it's flipping Spider-Man, man. Like, I don't know where this stacks up in Game of the Year. That's another interesting discussion that maybe we can get into on the 20M podcast. Like, how does this compare to other games of like that are coming out, which such a phenomenal game, such a phenomenal slate of release games. But I would say it's definitely a contender for Game of the Year.
Very cool, very cool. All right, I think that kind of concludes our little Marvel Spider-Man 2 review. Was there anything else you want to add before we sign off, Arif?
No, text me for those that are watching this. Thanks again. Thanks PlayStation for like.
We'll put Arif's number in.
Yeah, text me your thoughts. No, it's one of those ones again. Like I want to talk to people about this game, and I think similar to one of the other games that we reviewed. Like if you played Spider-Man, shoot me a DM, shoot me a text. Like I want to talk about it. Let us know in the comments. Like. Again, it's so hard to balance spoilery, non-spoilery stuff. Just like I want to talk about this game, and I can't wait for the discussion to see what people love and what people don't like. And I want to have a lot more of that nuanced discussion with maybe some spoilers later on in the year. But for now, what can I say? It's Spider-Man.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for listening to our Spider-Man 2. We'll catch you soon.